Namaskar students. Today we are moving into the English lecture number 8. And in the last lecture we discussed about what were the ideas that greatly influenced the post-Cold War world or the post-Soviet order. In this lecture we will go to some of the major events that took place in what I call the post-Soviet order. Going with Kenneth Walt's philosophy that the bipolar world breaks down and that because of it, stability also can come down. And so if you see, there were several events that needs our attention and analysis as well. The first is what happens to a former superpower. Many people said that it was the third worldization of the successor state Russia. But let us look at the facts. All of you know recently Vladimir Putin went to the polls and in a national referendum on constitutional amendments, he will be president of Russia till 2036. Extraordinarily shrewd former KGB agent. And the Asian, please remember, Russia is still, despite many territories that have broken away, is still the largest country on earth. The Asian portion of Russia, mostly encompassing Siberia, makes up for more than 75% of the country's territory, with 22% of its population at 2.5 people per kilometer. So COVID is very difficult in this area. And Russia is also by far the largest country with a total area of 17 million square kilometers. Despite its large area, it has a very, very small population. And this is Vladimir Putin, the strong man, giving you certain personal details of him. He was born in Leningrad, what is called St. Petersburg today. And please remember, Russia is commonly accepted as a major great power as well as a regional power. This is the Russian Federation. You can see how huge it is. In recent years, it is also called an energy superpower because of the pipeline politics. The country has the world's largest natural gas reserves and the 8th largest oil reserves. This is among the known reserves, unknown reserves, and the 2nd largest coal reserves in the world. Russia is also the leading natural gas exporter, 2nd largest oil exporter as well as an oil producer. It is the 3rd largest electricity producer in the world and the 5th largest renewable energy producer. The latter because of the well-developed hydroelectricity production in the country. So if you see, it has huge rivers on which it has several natural resources. Even in nuclear power, the Asian part of Russia also features major hydropower stations and gigantic hydroelectric potential of Siberia and Russian Far East largely remains unexploited. Russia also is the first country to develop civilian nuclear power and to construct the world's first nuclear power plant. Currently, the country is the 4th largest nuclear energy producer, with all nuclear power in Russia being managed by the Rosatom State Corporation. And as most of you know, it also has floating nuclear power plants and is intended to provide power to Russian Arctic coastal cities and gas rigs starting in 2012, which is already the Arctic policy of Russia also includes an offshore oil field. So if you see, huge natural resources. Russia under Putin, if most of you have seen, has become a very important player in what is called the Middle East or West Asia. If most of you know, in the issue, especially with Iraq also, during Saddam Hussein's period, they did try to, in the last minute, help out Saddam Hussein, but it didn't work. And most of you know, it was the Russian SS-20s that really helped Saddam Hussein to a large extent. Now presently the Syrian civil war, they are the ones who really saved President Bashar al-Assad's regime. What looked to be a certain defeat, but for Russia it wouldn't have been possible. So in Syria, as a springboard, Russia has transformed old relationships throughout the region and forged new ones. The Kremlin has raised its profile among the Persian Gulf Arab states. And here, if you see, to a large extent, the Kremlin has done business with most of the West Asian states, especially Sadat's, Nasser's Egypt, including Syria, as well as even now with Iran and others, and Iraq. It was a very, very close ally of Saddam Hussein before Saddam Hussein changed sides to the United States of America. Another, if you see the relationship between Russia and Israel, this also is a blossoming relationship. Israel is the region's most capable military actor. Thanks to the expanded Russian military presence in Syria, Russia is now effectively Israel's neighbor. And it is extremely important that they have relations. So when we talk about Russia, the successor state to a former superpower, the Soviet Union, Russia has not lost its power to such a low extent. Please remember, with nuclear weapons, with several things, Russia is way, way ahead. And it maintains all that, and it is also an energy superpower. And in the Middle East, or what we call West Asia, it has become an important power broker. Number two, Europe. Is Europe still what it was? There is one view that believes that the Cold War has shifted from Europe to Asia. So in spite of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia into several states, Europeans after the Cold War are divided on key issues. Despite European integration, European strategy, Europe may not possess much collective military power, but it does retain important soft power while remaining an major economic actor. The Euro crisis of 2008 made many countries rethink the European Union project. Economists fear that the current EU economic problems would see high unemployment, low economic growth, and deteriorating social conditions. And now with COVID, things could have been even worse. So EU is in serious trouble because of living standards are falling all over the Union. Political instability is fermenting in several of the states. Another issue that Europe has been plagued with, and there has been difference between the former East European states and the West European states, as most of you know, is the issue of migration. More than 3 years after Europe's biggest influx of migrants and refugees since the Second World War, tensions between the European Union member states over how to handle irregular immigration, or what we call illegal immigration, from outside the bloc, mainly from the Middle East and Africa, remain high. Because culturally, they are two different groups of people, and most of you know there have been a lot of problems in countries like France and others. And there have been certain states of East Europe who have said completely banned that they don't want refugees of a particular group. Any solution will have to balance the concern of frontline southern states, means like Greece, Italy, where they come in boats and literally swim across, with those of the wealthier northern destination states, while dealing with the refusal of hardline central and eastern ones such as Hungary and Poland to accept any migrants at all. And here if you see, European divisions have prepared their divisions, and there have been a lot of issues. The anti-immigration sentiment on the rise across the continent, the presence in Italy's government of the far-right League Party of Matteo Salvini, which campaigned on a pledge to send 500,000 irregular migrants home, is making itself felt. Similarly, the right-wing populist Freedom Party is sharing power in Austria. In Germany, which welcomed more than 1 million migrants in 2015 under the Angela Merkel open door policy, the right-wing AfD party has immigration firmly at the top of the political agenda. Polling shows immigration and terrorism remain the Europe's major and top concerns. Most of you know the most famous country to leave the European Union is Great Britain or United Kingdom. And in a referendum they had in 2016, they voted for it, and if you see on 31st January 2020, they completely withdrew. So if you see, to a very large extent, there are certain rich countries who don't want to be a part of the European Union. So the broad consent among economists is that Brexit will likely harm UK's economy, but then you're having nationalists like President Trump in the United States of America and Boris Johnson in Great Britain who don't think that way. So Brexit is likely to reduce immigration from European Economic Area countries to the UK and poses challenges for UK higher education, academic research and security. Following Brexit, if you see, to a very large extent, there has been a lot of debate over this. Now we are moving, see, Europe is in a flux. It is thinking whether it should have, whether it should stay as one or go back to the old thing of separate countries. The issue that whether the rich countries like Germany, France, and Great Britain till now, which bore the brunt of most of the finances of the European Union compared to the poorer countries, Britain has already said, no thank you now. Now the question is, how long is Germany and France going to take on this burden? And most of you know, even vis-a-vis NATO, you have had the United States of America literally making it very clear to its European partners that they should share the expenses of the NATO, that the United States is not going to help everything as it did after the Second World War. At that time, they were totally war-torn and destroyed countries. They helped them rebuild. Now they are very rich countries, so they can afford to pay or their share. So you have what to say, even within NATO, this whole concept coming in, that European states which are getting the security umbrella from the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, need to have paid for their security. Now the question of this new Asian century. There have been a lot of writers at the end of the Cold War who felt that the Cold War has shifted from Europe to Asia. Asia is going to become the new theater of the Cold War. This brought in geopolitical theories of especially the Heartland theory. And in the Heartland theory, the Heartland is what? Eurasia, especially the center there. And then they say, has this come back? The question that comes in is basically Asia is now, especially East Asia, China and the Southeast Asian countries with Japan are one of the fastest growing economic regions of the world. And you have West Asia and Central Asia with huge amounts of resources, especially West Asia with oil and gas, especially energy. And India becomes important because India is at the head of the Indian Ocean, an ocean that is totally open 12 months of the year. It doesn't get unnavigable, and it has become an important link from East Asia to West Asia, and India is at the head of it. So India is like a bridge, and we cannot get out of this. So we are seen as a geopolitical pivot. Now if we see that these countries, how are they going to now function with this changed international flux? Because you have one power that no longer is going to police, and you have only one superpower, which we in the last lecture said, is it a hyperpower? But there is also problems with the United States we have seen in this period, that it cannot go alone. It needs allies. And here, if you see, the challenge is coming from China. China does not want to share power in Asia with anybody else. It has been trying to, gobble up territories, which were not. For it started with Tibet, and from Tibet it has gone with Hong Kong also. Most of you know, in 1997, when the British gave up Hong Kong, they did get certain treaty commitments, but the present Chinese government, under its wolf warrior diplomacy, is refusing to go by those commitments. And there is a huge question to Hong Kong's autonomy and independence. And there has been also protests in Hong Kong against this. And recently they passed a security law that has. And China, there is a whole controversy over this COVID-19, which has been one of the worst health disasters globally. It is a lab-created virus or bacteria, some people say, and problem is it is not. It does no heat or extreme cold. It survives in all weathers. And whether this was a part of a biological warfare, what did it get out by mistake, or what? Nobody knows, because China is not ready to come out clean about it, because it first started from Wuhan. And if you see, the United States and China have had a very, acrimonious relationship, to put it as of now, because especially because of this COVID-19, the United States has been affected a lot. Most of the economies all over the world, it has become a great challenge to international order. And also the death rates are high, and there is no vaccine that can protect people from this. Everybody is under lockdown, and this can create other health disasters like depression and other issues. So if you see, Mike Pompeo, the United States Secretary of State, has literally mentioned that that China, especially the Chinese Communist Party, is behaving like a criminal organization. And if we see the new Asian century, is it going to be stable, or is it going to be, there's going to be a great rivalry? What has China done during the COVID? It says that South China Sea is our lake, and it has started trying to again take away territories in the Himalayas from India. And if you see, India has stood up, and because of this, are we going to have a peaceful rise of Asia, or is it going to be again the same old territorial conflict? See, unlike Europe, in Asia, territorial conflicts have not been resolved. India, China with even Russia. I don't understand why they should have needled the Russians. So if you see, to a very large, the German geopolitical thinker, Karl Hofstadter, termed this called the Pacific Age, envisaging growth of Japan, China, and India. He said a giant space is expanding before our eyes, with forces pouring into it, which at the dawn of the Pacific Age, the successor to the Atlantic Age, the over-age Mediterranean and European Age. So you have a new area that is coming in. So in this Asian century, basically many people say this phrase Asian century comes in when Deng Xiaoping and the Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi met in the 1980s especially, and later 1985 the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations hearing, basically that popularly which came in as called the Asian century. Now, is there really a power shift? As international relations students and others, the question we should ask is really, Kishore Mahbubani provides 7 pillars that rendered the Asian countries to excel and provided themselves with the possibility to compete. The 7 pillars, according to him, are free market economics, science and technology, meritocracy, pragmatism, culture of peace, and rule of law and education. You don't have rule of law in China. It's an authoritarian Marxist state. Professor John West, in his book Asian Century on a Knife Edge, argues also that over the course of the 21st century, India could well emerge as in Asia's leading power. China would never like the statement. Already India's economy is growing faster than China's, a trend which could continue unless China gets serious about economic reform. Further, India's population will overtake China in 2022 and could be some 50% higher by 2100. I don't know whether we should see this as a, positive or as a negative. It has become the new truth of our age that the Western world we have known is fast losing its preeminence, and it may be replaced by an Asian order. China's economic rise has been, and also its recent aggressive expansionism has brought a lot of tensions. And as most of you know, there have been a lot of countries from around the world. Now, what are the challenges that we'll see that with Asia? One, as I told you, we have not resolved territorial disputes. So to have something like an European integration is very, very difficult. A lot of states, lot of issues in West Asia, the Shia-Sunni problem, on in South Asia, we are at each other's necks, and China is extremely unreliable, even as a regional power, forget being a global power. And with this recent COVID-19, the way the Chinese have acted, it has left a lot of world people very, very unhappy, because Chinese power is aggressive, intrusive, and interventionist, which many people would not like. The second is on the issue of growing equality within countries, in which wealth and opportunities, economic and social cohesion are issues. Many countries like Pakistan have become more or less the centers of world terrorism. We have become the training camp of the world for terror. Then there are intense competition over finite natural resources, especially water. You have somebody like Brahma Chalani, who has written a book saying that the future wars in Asia are going to be fought on natural resources, especially water. See China, how aggressive it is on that Three Gorges Dam. Even with people warned that it might have natural disasters, it wants to change even the course of the Brahmaputra. Global warming, climate change. Other problem is rampant corruption and an aging population. How are we going to the issue of consumption, labor force? I would even put human trafficking. All this have been major challenges to the Asian century. Now, the other concept that comes in and that has been greatly coming in is the concept of the Indo-Pacific. It's a geopolitical concept. Again, the German geopolitician Karl Haushofer first used it in the 1920s in his academic work. Since then, it has been intermittently used. In the 2000s, there have been security linkages. And let me tell you, the United States military commands have used this, and they were the first to change from Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific. In India, in 2007, Gurpreet Khurana, in the strategic analysis, the security of sea lanes, prospects of India-Japan cooperation. In this article, he refers to Indo-Pacific, to the maritime space stretching from the littorals of East Africa and West Asia across the Indian Ocean and Western Pacific Ocean to the littorals of East Asia. The spirit of the term was picked up later by the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, as reflected in his speech in the Indian Parliament in August 2007, that talked about the water confluence of the Indian and Pacific Oceans as the dynamic coupling of seas of freedom and prosperity in the broader Asia. Now you have got what is called the quadrilateral security dialogue, or what we call the Quad. From 2010 onwards, the Indo-Pacific acquired salience, and many in the Indian establishment also started using, as well as Indian academics. From 2011 onwards, the term has been frequently used by strategic. Please understand that this Indo-Pacific is not something new. If we invert the map of India, if you look at it, the Cholas, the great seafaring dynasty, please understand, unfortunately, they ruled for 1600 years. They are the longest dynasty in human history. But we in Indian history don't learn about them. As much as the Mughals, who just ruled for 200 years, have been put up. So this dynasty created cultural posts and trading posts in entire Indo-Pacific region. So it is as old as the Chola dynasty, the golden period of the Indo-Pacific. However, if you see in this quad, who is there basically? It is Australia, Japan, the United States of America, and India. Especially in the recent problem with China, the quad has come together, and to a large extent it has proved that it is a very important alliance in trying to contain Chinese expansionism. Now in 2019, if you see the US Department formalizing the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific to be sustained by the Quad, a partnership of 4 Indo-Pacific democracies led by the United States of America in concert with Australia, India, and Japan. So Indo-Pacific has featured prominently in top level US strategic documents as such from 2017. It has also argued that the concept of the Indo-Pacific may lead to a change in popular mental maps of how the world is understood in strategic terms. So if you see, earlier it started as Indo-Asia Pacific, now it has become just Indo-Pacific, very much like the Chola period of rule. Now, like-minded democracies is something that came with our Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he met with the United States of President Donald Trump. So if you see very clearly, the Indo-Pacific region was something that came into thing, especially strengthening free and fair trade and energy linkages and promoting stability in the area. Now another term also that has from the Cold War, we had the Third World. Now are we still called the Third World? No. Why? Because the Second World has disappeared. The Second World was the communist world. The First World was the Western democracies. So then we had the Third World, which were the non-aligned or the other states. We are not. We are now called the Global South because the Global North has most of the rich countries. The least developed countries, especially which are burdened with debt and debt payments, we have many of them in South Asia. And the new international economic order that was floated by the non-aligned movement. And after that, if you see, most of this has, in the post-World War world, there is not so much of relevance to this whole thing because this was basically an organization which was against the 2 huge superpowers. Now with one of the superpowers giving up its responsibilities, this Third World is something that is not very fashionable nowadays. Rather we call it the Global South. Now from 9/11 to the Arab Spring, see another earth-breaking tectonic shift took place, and the major thing on what we call the war on terror that has come in, and especially Samuel Huntington's thing of basically the Christian civilization and the Islamic civilization having a civilizational fault lines. 9/11 effectively brought the post-Cold War era, especially the so-called globalization and free movement and all this, to an end. It transformed United States and United States foreign policy, tremendously. The reasons for going to war in Iraq have been much disputed. Many people say it was a strategic error. Maybe Iraq was safer, maybe with Saddam Hussein still in power. Now, the other thing that has come in is many people question that can democracy be transplanted? This issue is basically come in with the Arab Spring. And in Arab Spring, basically, many people believe that not only there was an internal movement, especially something that began with Tunisia, especially because of oppressive regimes and a low standard of living, starting with protests in Tunisia. If you see the whole Cold War period, when we talked of Zach in the last lecture, I told you that fundamentalisms rose because during the Cold War, the United States and her allies saw to it that no socialist or left parties survived in the Arab and Muslim world. They literally, saw to it that they destabilized these governments. So there are many examples we took at that time. From Tunisia, if you see, the protests moved on to 5 other countries: Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, where either the ruler was deposed, like in Ben Ali in Tunisia, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Hosni Mubarak, and then Ali Abdullah Saleh. So Yemen. And Yemen also is still under his war-ridden, and there's huge suffering, and many people say it's a human disaster. There are major uprisings and social violence occurred, including riots, civil wars, and insurgencies. Sustained street demonstrations took place in Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, Iran, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, and Sudan. Minor protests occurred in Djibouti, Mauritania, and Palestine National Authority, Saudi Arabia, and Western Sahara. A major slogan of the demonstrators was in the Arab world was the people want to bring down the regime. See, the importance of external, the question that comes in here is this totally internal movement, or is it literally, there have been external powers that took interest? Because what happens is none of them succeeded in bringing about a democratic revolution. So many people say it's not an Arab Spring, it is an Arab winter. One is the social media played a very major role. The power struggle, especially in the Arab world, the early popular movements, also a lot of it, the social media. The causes, what are the causes? Please understand, the world watched the events, especially gripped by the narrative of a young generation peacefully rising up against oppressive authoritarian to secure a more democratic political system and a brighter economic future. The Arab Spring is widely believed to have been instigated by dissatisfaction, particularly of youth and unions, with the rule of local governments, though some of them speculated that wide gaps in income levels and pressures caused by the Great Recession may also have a hand in this. So numerous factors led to the protests, including issues such as monarchy, human rights violations, political corruption, economic decline, unemployment, extreme poverty, and a number of demographic structural factors, and a large percentage of educated and dissatisfied youth within an entire population. Now, if we analyze all these so-called uprisings, most of it is focused on the role of social media and digital technology. The influence of the social media on political activism, especially, many people believe, was quite high, especially in urban areas, but in rural areas it was not. See, the use of social media platforms, with the exception of Libya, many of them believe that Facebook, Twitter, and other major social media players had a key role in the movement in Egypt and Tunisia. Now, if we look at there have been a lot of studies on how far has technology influenced any uprisings, the collaborative internet utilities to effect a government change. Even now in the United States, you're having a lot of these protests that are going on. They are also social media. You see anything you write on the social media, if you don't agree with them, you have a mob that trolls you. So this basically comes to what to say authoritarianism by a particular ideology. There is no free speech. So there has been a lot of issues that have come into, that is mental power of crowds. And with this, many people believe that how are we as international relations theorists going to see this power of the internet, especially what people call webocracy. That means the collaborative revolution. People from different parts of the world are ready to come out for a cause which they think they can use against any particular, and anybody who opposes it is badly trolled and demonized. This is very dangerous. And what are the limitations of this? The limitations basically is wherever there is low internet penetration, there has not been such a great success, but electronic media devices have to a large extent helped to spread protests in Egypt, especially in Cairo and mosques, and social networks help coordinate and communicate among these members. Now, basically, when we are going to look upon the movement, this movement was not a great success. Most of you know that they were Muslim Brotherhood that came to power in Egypt. Was later again there was a military takeover, and because they had started discriminating against minorities. This is another major issue that is coming up with the Islamic world. Many people believe that dictators, modern dictators like Saddam Hussein, Assad, and others may not treat minorities equally. They are second-class citizens, but they don't kill, rape, murder, maim, or use them as sex slaves like the ISIS did. So there is a great worry that the so-called fundamentalist, popular Islamic groups that come to power are unable to treat minorities with human rights, basic rights. So many people believe that the dictators are much better. Okay, they don't give freedom to anybody. They also have other issues of limitations of freedom and independence, but at least they do not do the things that these so-called popular groups do, like the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood is seen by various parts of the world as a terrorist organization, as a fundamentalist organization. Please remember, one group of this group only killed Anwar Sadat, assassinated him because he tried to make peace with Israel. So you have these issues that have been coming up, and many people believe that the biggest Arab Spring was the biggest transformation since decolonization. But at the same time, this geopolitical implications have been restricted. There have not been much of changes beyond that. So if you see, this has been a major movement in the post-Cold War world, but at the same time, not much of changes have come about. There is an Arab awakening, Arab uprisings, but many people believe it's not a spring, it's more like a winter, where it subsided after a particular point of time. So this comes into a very large extent, and it didn't take place in many countries like Saudi Arabia, which has been ruled by the Saud family, and maybe in Bahrain, where the Shia-Sunni divide is extremely wide still. For example, the recent explosion in Beirut, as most of you know, Lebanon was an extremely multi-religious state with Christians, Jews, Sunni Muslims, and Shia Muslims. But unfortunately, different groups have tried to, break this fragile equation, thereby, endangering the peace in the region. So you have now Erdogan's Turkey, which wants to become the leader of Sunni countries, a state that through Kemal Ataturk was secular state. They took over a cathedral, made it into a mosque, and then Ataturk, Hagia Sophia, made it into a museum, saying that nobody is getting it. But now you have Erdogan who says, no, it's going to become a mosque again. It's very surprised that he has given up the Ataturk, promise of secularism, which is extremely, and you have Saudi Arabia, which is competing in the Sunni world. And then you have Iran, which is a Shia power, Iraq, which is also a Shia majority state now. And this whole equations are going on in West Asia or the Middle East, which is extremely unstable, and their own equations with Israel, which is a state that many Arab states do not want to accept its existence, though many have accepted as well. So if you see, to a large extent, this is a century where, yes, religious identities have come to the forefront, and they are the ones that are wars can happen. And you also have an expansionist China, a communist party that is extremely, extreme nationalism, which also makes it expansionist. And there's a whole issue of secretiveness which has come in with this Wuhan virus. So we are now in a conundrum in international relations in this period, and it has to be seen how the Asian century is going to come in. Is it there going to be an Asian century, or there is going to be again a containment of China by the Quad? And Russia is still very neutral about it, and Russia has not said much in this. So Russia is also a key player, and it would not like to give up its preponderance to China. So it's very interesting that I stop here, and we'll go into the next lecture. Thank you.